behind the human power brokers, there's a more sinister intelligence that wants to destroy, that wants to enslave, that wants you to worship them.
John did not write this book as a secret code for you to decipher the timetable of Jesus' return. It's a symbolic vision that brought hope and challenge to the 7 first-century churches and every generation of Christians since. It reveals history's pattern and God's promise that every human kingdom eventually becomes Babylon and must be resisted in the power of the slain Lamb.
Welcome to another episode of Ring Them Bells, where we're rediscovering the Bible on its own terms. As always, I just want to take a second and ask you to subscribe. It means so much for this channel for you to take a quick second. Please like, please share, please subscribe. It helps us so much get the good news out about what Jesus has done for this world.
You know, there's a lot of I'm going to use the H word, hopelessly ambiguous language in this passage. I'll just say this. If you come across anyone that claims that they have this totally figured out, that person can be safely ignored. So, all the views of problem passages. It's just hopelessly difficult to try to be able to figure out which system is correct and how to sort of piece all this together. My view is that all of that is intentional. Again, I think prophecy, future prophecy works exactly the way that prophecy worked the first time. You're not supposed to know until hindsight. God has a reason for not putting all the cards on the table. Okay. Again, you say, well, that's like a cop-out view. That's a cheating view. Well, call it what you want. It's my view. And every one of the systems will run into something that just is really difficult for the system to handle. And so it has to adapt or I'm going to say this. With a few of them, you really can say things like, they just got to make stuff up, to make it work. I was raised in classic dispensational thought. That was my first Christian context. And classic dispensationalism is Charles Ryrie, and C.I. Scofield. Those guys. And Ryrie got to the point where you have to understand, classic dispensationalism, I've been trying to teach you that prophecy is already but not yet. You got both things working. Classic dispensationalism says there is no already. It's all not yet. And so when Ryrie would get cornered on like kingdom language and stuff like this, he literally, in one of his books, he wanted so badly for the new covenant to not be fulfilled in the New Testament that he said, well, then we need to expect a new covenant. Like he just made up a new covenant, like right there in the book. I'm going to call my covenant the Mike covenant. You'll see stuff like this happen that, again, when you look back on it, it makes you laugh, but like he was serious. He was serious about this, and he was a major figure in biblical scholarship in that tradition. I would say, end times can be fun, but it can very easily become something that you just, get caught up in it, and it becomes frustrating, because there's just so much ambiguity.
Number one is, if you see somebody marrying their view of end times to either A, the gospel, or B, someone's level of commitment to Jesus, okay, then that individual has a spiritual problem. And as a pastor, I would hope you'd tell them that. Since none of us in the room are omniscient, okay, try to get everybody else to admit they're not omniscient, which is actually a taller order than you would think, especially on Facebook. The only thing I would put in the wrong category in these kinds of discussions is when these subjects become substitutes for one of those two things. And trust me, I know there are people who cross that line. So I'm going to try to be more concerned about the stuff that there is greater clarity on, because I'm going to assume that that's what God wanted me to focus on. But honestly, there are some people, that's where they're at. They may not realize, some of them do, but they may not realize it, but that's really what's running through their head. Like I know the answer to every question. Why can't you see it?
So one more thing that I wanted to talk about was 666 or 616, missing the mark of the beast. Let's walk through the mark of the beast, analyzing the dates supposed for Revelation, by analyzing the emperors and then using gematria to see Rome as the beast, and Nero as the mold for the Antichrist. So tell me what you think about that.
Yeah, in the book, I'm super interested in this question of the mark of the beast for obvious reasons, because it seems to be a question that a lot of people are interested in. Through the years, through the decades, we have seen the mark of the beast find its way through church, lore, I guess you could say. First it was the social security number. If you found 666 on your, those numbers in sequence on your social security card or driver's license, you needed to get rid of them. There were rumors that this would be a barcode. And so when barcodes became a thing, I mean, wow, this is definitely the latest technology. And so we need to watch out for it. Through the years, it's kind of morphed into different things. When computers came literally online, we started thinking maybe it's a computer thing, then microchips, tattoos. It was attached to presidential leaders of countries. Ronald Wilson Reagan, each of his names has 6 letters in it. So he's clearly 666, or if it's Kissinger, or if it's Mikhail Gorbachev, because he had a birthmark on his head, and the mark of the beast is said to be on a forehead. And so he seemed like a candidate as well. My point is to say there were just a ton of different rumors going on. And what it did was, culturally, is it led to a lot of fear, right?
Yeah.
And because people were concerned that they were going to accidentally take the mark of the beast. And so I really wanted to explore that question. Specifically, can you accidentally take this thing? And before I could talk about the mark of the beast, though, I really needed to talk about the beast. And I think that's the key to understanding what's going on.
Signs. The word literally means symbols, and these chapters are full of them. These visions explore the message of the open scroll in greater depth. The first one reveals the cosmic spiritual battle that lay behind the suffering of the 7 churches under Roman persecution. It's a manifestation of that ancient conflict that began in Genesis chapter 3. The serpent, who represents the source of all evil, is depicted here as a dragon. It attacks a woman and her seed. They represent the Messiah and his people. Then the Messiah defeats the dragon through his death and resurrection, and it's cast to earth. There, the dragon inspires hatred and persecution of the Messiah's people. But they will conquer the dragon by resisting his influence, even if it kills them. John's trying to show the churches that neither Rome nor any other nation or human is the real enemy. There are dark spiritual powers at work, and Jesus' followers will announce Jesus' victory by remaining faithful and loving their enemies, just like the slain lamb. John's next vision retells the story of the same conflict, but this time in the earthly symbolism of Daniel's animal visions. John sees 2 beasts empowered by the dragon. One of them represents national military power that conquers through violence. The other beast symbolizes the economic propaganda machine that exalts this power as divine. And these beasts demand full allegiance from the nations, and that's symbolized by taking the mark of the beast and his number, 666, on the forehead or hand. Now, this is an infamous image, and you won't discover its meaning by reading news headlines. John's making a clear Hebrew Old Testament reference here. First of all, this mark is the anti-Shema. The writing on the forehead and hand, it's a clear reference to the Shema, an ancient Jewish prayer of allegiance to God that's found in the book of Deuteronomy. This prayer also was written on the forehead and hand as a symbol of devoting all your thoughts and actions to the one true God. But now the rebellious nations demand their own allegiance, and they force everyone to decide who they will follow. Then there's the number of the beast, which has fascinated readers for thousands of years. But this was not a mystery to John. He spoke Hebrew and Greek, and Hebrew letters were also numbers. If you spell the Greek words Nero Caesar and the word beast in Hebrew, each one amounts to 666. Now, John isn't saying that Nero was the only fulfillment of this vision. Nero's just a recent example of the ancient pattern set out by Daniel, that the nations become beasts when they exalt their own power and economic security as a false god and then demand total allegiance. So Babylon was the beast in Daniel's day, but that was followed by Persia, followed by Greece, and now Rome in John's day, and so it goes for any later nation that acts in the same way. Standing opposed to the beastly nations and the dragon is another king. It's the slain lamb. He's with his army who have given their lives to follow him. And from the New Jerusalem, their song of victory goes out to the nations in what John calls the eternal gospel. And they call everyone to repent and to worship God and to come out of Babylon that will fall. Its days are numbered.
So back up just a little bit. In Revelation, you have this dragon. He's really upset. He can't destroy this child that's come to the earth. And so he summons a beast from the earth and a beast from the sea. And this is an echo, of course, to Leviathan and Behemoth of Job. This is an echo of Isaiah 27, verse 1, where Leviathan is mentioned there as a crooked serpent, a twisting serpent. You have other passages, Psalm 74, I believe, talks about Leviathan too. And interestingly, in the Greek Old Testament, Leviathan is sometimes translated as drakon, which is dragon. And drakon is what you get in Revelation. Okay, so you have this dragon figure who summons these beasts, and we want to ask ourselves, okay, well, what is this beast? Specifically, one of the beasts receives a lot of attention here, and this beast is said to have 7 heads, there's questions like, well, what's up with the 7-headed beast? Interestingly, in the Old Testament, you have a sea serpent who has multiple heads, and in antiquity, sometimes you could find a beast with 7 heads. So this is popular imagery of the time, I think, a 7-headed beast. Well, what's interesting is that, and we don't often know this, but John actually tells us exactly how to interpret the 7-headed beast. He tells us in chapter 17 of Revelation that the heads represent 2 things. First, they represent a mountain, so there's 7 hills or 7 mountains. Moreover, each of those heads represent a king. So this is clearly metaphorical imagery. It's meant to point to another reality. It's not meant to draw attention to itself. The beast is a figure, a symbol of something else. And John says it's 7 mountains and 7 kings. And I think back in those days, people would immediately know what he's talking about. Rome was known as the city on 7 hills or 7 mountains, right? There was a yearly festival that celebrated the city of 7 hills or the 7 mountains, Septimontium. And for example, the Roman historian Suetonius, he talks about this in his biography of the Emperor Domitian. Domitian was ruler in the late 80s and early 90s, which is around the time many scholars think Revelation was written. And so we know that around this time that this was a big deal. And so moreover, John says that they represent 7 mountains, but each of those heads represent a king, which kind of makes sense because it was in the city of Rome, the 7-hilled city, where the emperor lived in the 1st century. That's where the capital was. So it makes sense why the 7-headed monster would be associated with both kings and the hills. I think John's saying, guys, we're talking about Rome here, okay? You couldn't get much clearer. Now, for us who are 2,000 years removed from this, we would be like, Matt, that's a stretch, right? And I would say it might be for you, but it would not have been for the 1st century. It's kind of like if I go 2,000 years into the future from now, and I get to talk to the people around that time, and I say, hey guys, I'm going to go to the Big Apple tomorrow. They're going to look at me, what's the Big Apple, right? Well, you don't know what the Big Apple is? Why don't you know the Big Apple? Do you not know your history, American history? Well, no, we don't know. We barely know anything about America. It's been 2,000 years ago. I think the same thing goes here. We know the Big Apple is a reference to New York City, right? And I think that that's what's going on here, is that the 7-hilled city was kind of like another way to say the Big Apple. It meant Rome. People just knew that, okay? And so we need to recognize our own limitations, and we need to recognize how the first century readers would have recognized themselves what John was talking about. So, moreover, I also show in the book where or places, and I'm citing a scholar named Mark Wilson in one of his articles. But anyway, there are places outside of Scripture, okay, that call Nero and Domitian, or Nero's called a beast, yeah, and Domitian is too. So now I'm second guessing myself and go back, but I do know Nero is definitely called a beast, and the two were often conflated together.
Yeah.
And no, Domitian is called a beast. Anyway, sorry. And so you have data outside of the biblical narrative that show that this language of beast was often used to talk about these two really corrupt, nefarious emperors. And so maybe, maybe John's doing the same thing. He's using the idea of a beast to refer to, we've already established Rome. And so is he picking out the emperor here? Is he using this language too?
I hope you guys are enjoying this series. We have so much left to explore. I just wanted to take a quick second and ask you to subscribe. This channel is growing rapidly, and I am so grateful for the reach that God is giving it. But I pray that we can go even further with the message and the good news of what God has done for this world. So please like, please share, please subscribe. Help us get the good news out there. Let's get back to the message.
We also know from history, Roman history, that Nero was often made fun of by his own citizens, and apparently he just let it go. Nero was very unpredictable. You didn't know if he was going to kill you one minute or just laugh you off. But nonetheless, this sort of thing happened. People would take his name and make fun of him. And the way they would do it, though, was sort of creative. They practice what's called gematria. And the gematria is this idea where you take a person's name and you substitute for the letters of the name the numerical equivalent. So let me explain this a little bit more. For English speakers, we have two different types of script. We have a lettered script that we use to write our, we have A, B, C, and D, that we use those to write letters, right? But we also have another set of script, Arabic numerals that we use to write numbers, 1, 2, 3. They're just two separate types of script. In Greek, in Latin, and in Hebrew, that wasn't the case. Some languages have to reuse their letters for their numbers. So think of Roman numerals, right? Think of how you would take say in Greek, the first letter of the alphabet would be alpha, and then alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon. So alpha would be number 1. It's also the equivalent letter of A, but it's also for them number 1. Beta is number 2. Alpha, beta, gamma, 1, 2, 3. And so that's the practice of gematria. So if you could take my name, Matt, and you can find the numerical equivalent to M-A-T-T, and have fun with it. Well, we know from history that this is what sometimes happened to Nero. They would make fun of him, right? And use his numerical name. What's interesting is when you go to the Bible, you can make that number 666. You can make it probably mean whatever you want to. It all depends on what name you use, right? But what is interesting, and scholars note this, is that if you take Nero's name, Neron Kaiser, okay, Nero Caesar. If you take that name in Greek and you transliterate it into Hebrew, it comes out to 666. Now, that's one way to spell his name, Neron Kaiser. If you say Nero Kaiser, you drop, instead of saying Neron, you say Nero, you drop one of those letters, you get another number. You get 616. Now, we are familiar with the number 666, but that's actually not the only number in the manuscript history that we have. And if you look and do a deep dive into the manuscript history of Revelation, another number shows up. It's not always 666 in the text. Some would say, some show 616, 616. Which some scholars have said that's probably further evidence that the scribes who were transcribing these texts knew exactly who they were talking about, maybe a Nero figure. It's debatable there, but it is very, very interesting in that respect. So so the argument that I give in the book, and I go into much more detail than this.
Hold on one second, just to make that connect, because I think you missed a little link there, is to say that, like,
Okay.
with the 616, what you're saying is that this different spelling is what lines up with that, and that's why. So just explain that a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah. Great point. So 666 can be made to show Neron Heiser. Another way to spell Nero's name is Nero Heiser, but that's 616. And in the manuscript history, we actually have both numbers. Some manuscripts have 666 for the mark of the beast, and then others have 616. Both of those fit in the Nero name pretty darn well. So all to say, I've concluded that the beast is definitely, I'll just say this. It's for John, the symbol of evil. And the most prominent symbol of evil in his day would be Rome. Okay. And so I think that's what's going on here. And so, but now we have the mark of the beast. What's the mark of the beast? Well, this is very interesting too, because I think it fits the data as well. When you go through Revelation and you do I encourage everybody to do this. Go find every reference to mark of the beast. It's always associated with yeah, I don't think there's like one instance where it's not, but it's by vast majority of the time, if not, it's always associated with worshiping the beast. Specifically, worshiping the image of the beast. There's a close association between taking the mark of the beast, in other words, and worshiping the beast, the image of the beast. Okay, those two tend to go together. They do in those instances. Okay, so what do we do with that? Well, it's pretty interesting because we have data from that time period that show that Caesar's image was often forced to be worshipped, or at times forced to be worshipped, and just was generally worshipped at that time period. So, for example, you can look to the letters of Pliny. Pliny was a Roman governor of the nearby province Bithynia, which would be next door neighbors to the Asian churches. Okay, the next door neighbors to Turkey, and that area. And anyway, and I think the year it was 112 AD. So if Revelation was written in 95, you're looking at just a decade or so difference. Pliny writes back to the emperor of the time, Trajan, and says, "Hey, I've got some Christians. We've arrested them. What's our policy here? With respect to how we punish them? Because I'm kind of weeding them out, by making them worship your image, and if they don't, then they're considered obstinate or whatever, and they could die." And so, we know that in that time frame, we just kind of look at all the data that you have a beast that's called Caesar, and Caesar is associated with the city of seven hills, Rome. He's clearly associated, it seems, with this weird number 666, or gematria, I should say. He's associated with gematria. And now we have instances where the image of the Caesar is worshipped. If you don't worship him, you could die. I mean, we have data support it. If you look at just each one of those by itself, it's like, oh, that's interesting. But when you put all the data together, you have this composite picture that, oh, wait, I think I know what John's talking about here. He's talking about the first century Roman practice of worshiping the Caesars. And so I think that's what's going on with the mark of the beast. But let me say one more tidbit here, because if you notice really carefully, the mark of the beast is associated with buying and selling. Like if you don't have the mark, you will not be able to buy or sell. Okay. So let's unpack that a little bit. But before I get to the economic side, let me just say something about the mark. John is not the first person to talk about marks going on people's bodies. Okay. He's not the first person to do that. And he's not just talking about a mark of the beast. He also has in his letters to the seven churches, he has another mark, what Craig Keener calls the mark of the Lamb. It's really interesting, and we always miss this. So when you read Revelation 13, verses 16 to 18, you have the mark of the beast. But in the very next verse, chapter 14, verse 1, he starts talking about another mark. It's a mark on the righteous.
Yep, that's right. So the mark is one wonderful example about an imagery, an evocative image that John uses, the mark of the beast. So he's developing the mark and the name of the beast, and having the name. Remember our conversation with Carmen Imes about the bearing the name? So having the name upon you, your right hand, and your forehead, these are all images for how faithful Israelites bore the name of Yahweh, said the Shema as a symbol on their hands and their foreheads. And this is all symbolic language about with your mind and with your actions and with your heart. The Shema shows your allegiance to the God of the name. And the beast and the dragon, all they can do is imitate the true God. And so the mark of the beast is, it's an anti-messianic Shema. So what that tells me is that the image has nothing to do about a chip implant. What it tells me, what is the beast in the Revelation? The beast is a socioeconomic system of oppression and violence. And it seems to me, I am taking the mark of the beast more when I thoughtlessly contribute to or benefit from and don't even become aware of these systems of oppression that I'm part of. That's another equally appropriate way to interpret this, the sign and the number of the beast. And that would be the metaphorical lens approach.
So you have two marks, okay? And the important thing to think about with the mark of the beast is that it doesn't seem to be a mark that makes you righteous or unrighteous. No, it seems to be a mark that shows whether you are righteous or unrighteous. In other words, it's an identity marker. Okay, you get the mark of the beast because you're unrighteous. You have sworn allegiance to Team Beast. You have the mark of the Lamb when you've sworn allegiance to the Lamb. And so we actually can look in the Old Testament and see this really clearly, in fact. In Ezekiel chapter 9, for example, God is about to destroy the temple. But he tells the angel, he says, hey, go off and mark the righteous on the forehead and mark them so that they'll be spared from the judgment that is to come. So that mark on the forehead in Ezekiel is a mark of identification to say, don't destroy this person because they're marked off righteous. Another text from the Jewish antiquity around 100 BC is a text known as the Psalms of Solomon. And in chapter 15 of that text, you have a mark of the righteous and a mark of the unrighteous. And they are marks of identification, it seems there. All to say, when you come back to Revelation 13, it seems like the mark of the beast is a similar sort of thing. It's a mark to identify worshipers of the beast. So this would mean, and why this is important, is that you can't accidentally take this. Because as I said earlier, the mark of the beast is associated with worshiping the image of the beast. It's always associated with that. What that means is basically the mark of the beast just shows that you're a satanic worshiper, right? You can't accidentally be a satanic worshiper. And I mean, yeah. I mean, this seems in the context here to be an act of the will, and so let me get back to the buying and selling thing. So in that time period, you would literally have marks of the beast or Caesar everywhere. You'd have them on statues and images that people worship. They would be in temples. They would be at just local altars down the road and in little streets here and there. They would also be in your pocket in a coin. So on typical Roman coins, you would have the head of a Caesar, and it would have blasphemous sorts of language on it. It would say Caesar, son of the divine one, or something like that, or maybe Caesar Soter, or Savior, or whatever, right? And in fact, this was such a big issue that that some Jews, the ones who were really trying to stay faithful to God, they would not even carry Roman money on them because it was considered so blasphemous. It was like the mark of a monster, right? And so in that sense, unless you have the mark of the beast in a coin, you couldn't really buy or sell. Maybe that's what's going on here. Another option that some scholars might point to is in that time you had trade unions, kind of like what we have today. You would join a trade union for economic security or whatnot. And we know that a place like Thyatira, one of the cities Revelation is written to, it was known for having a lot of trade unions. Okay. Think of Acts chapter 19, when Paul is preaching and he's causing a riot. And Demetrius is really upset because people are not buying images of the gods anymore because they're becoming Christians. He's like, man, you're upsetting the economy here. And it says that he meets with tradesmen, basically trade unionists, to say, we got to stop this guy. And that's actually what would have happened, because these trade unions in Asia, for example, if you wanted to be a member of it, you'd probably have to go to their meetings, of course, which always included, one supposes, a feast. And those feasts would, definitely be dedicated to a deity, probably dedicated to Caesar. We know, for example, that presidents of trade unions often doubled as leaders of the imperial cult. So the imperial cult was like these temples that were dedicated to the worship of Caesar. And I think there's one, I can't think of where it's at off the top of my head, but there's one instance, I think I cited in the book, where we have an inscription that shows that a leader of a trade union was actually also involved with the imperial cult temple. So you have some crossover there. So all to say, I don't think Christians in Asia would have been welcomed or would have felt comfortable at all in a trade union, because they couldn't pray or dedicate their food to Caesar or whatnot. So, there's lots of little ways of understanding this, but you really couldn't buy or sell. You couldn't participate in the economy if you didn't participate in the marks of the beast, right? So I think those are helpful for understanding.
Are we living in the end times? What is the mark of the beast? And who is the Antichrist? Is the rapture biblical or something our Western world invented? Make sure to check out this full interview as we go over Revelation and the end of the world as you know it. This interview will bring the hope of the gospel and a biblical understanding of the end times. Stay tuned. The beginning is near.